Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. Guys, my co-host today, fascinating guy named Jefferson Morley. He runs a fantastic website called jfkfacts.org that I go to every single day. Sometimes we link to articles from there on our FFF Daily. Jeff is the author of two fantastic books, one called Our Man in Mexico, which is about a CIA agent named Winfield Scott, and another one called Snowstorm in August. So, Jeff, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Jacob.
Yeah, you posted a really fascinating article on JFK Facts yesterday about the JFK records relating to the JFK assassination that are still yet to be released by the National Archives. And so I thought I'd have you on the show to discuss those records as well as other things relating to the JFK assassination. The video you posted yesterday was kind of interesting from this woman from the National Archives talking about the scheduling for the release of documents that are still being kept secret. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about these secret documents, give us the background behind them, why they still haven't been released more than 50 years after the assassination? Like, what's going on here?
So we have to go back to understand. You got to go back to Oliver Stone's movie JFK, which portrays the assassination of the president as a political plot by enemies within his own government. Created a tremendous furor when it came out. It was a very slick and compelling movie, and it was very controversial. A lot of people in the media and Washington establishment accused Stone of making things up, of distorting the facts, conspiracy theorist, et cetera, et cetera. And Stone replied, he said, well, if the government doesn't have anything to hide, why are all the records related to the assassination still secret? And it was a very good point. 80–90% of all the records that had been collected by the Warren Commission in the 60s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 70s, the Church Committee in the 70s, as late as 1992, 80–90% of all of that material was still secret. And so Congress, to kind of quell the furor, passed a law and said the government has to release all of its JFK records. And they made it was a pretty strong law. For the first time, they took the decision to make records public out of the hands of the agency, gave it to an independent civilian review board. And in the 1990s, we got a huge amount of JFK records. About 5 million pages were released. And this has really deepened our understanding of the events leading to the assassination and to the confused aftermath. But the law also allowed agencies to request the delay of release of their JFK material. For example, if there was the name of a living informant or a living intelligence agent, they had the right to request that be withheld. And so agencies like the CIA, the FBI, asked for the delay of the release of their JFK material. Under the law, they were allowed to request the delay for up to 25 years. So the law was passed in October 1992. Go fast forward 25 years, you're in October 2017. And on that date, all JFK records in possession of the government are supposed to become public, whether the agency requested a delay in the release or not. So that's what we're coming up against. And I've been reporting on JFK Facts. Okay, so what's going to happen? What has been withheld the longest over all these years? I mean, to me, it's kind of self-evident that the agencies would withhold the most sensitive material for as long as possible. So whatever's going to come out at the end may be very interesting because it's precisely the stuff they wanted to keep secret the longest. So the National Archives has begun to address this issue and talk about how they're going to handle the release of these JFK records. And so for the first time, I reported this week that the National Archives had given us a reasonably solid number. And Martha Murphy, who's the head of the JFK records collection at the National Archives here in Washington, gave a public presentation, which is on the site, and explains a little bit about how they're going to go about doing this. It's a pretty big job. They've got a staff of about 7 people working on this. There's a lot of records still to be released. 3,600 records have been withheld in full. That's records. So that, a record might be a 50-page memo. So that's a lot of material right there. And then she said that another 11% of the JFK records collection have significant redactions within the document. So the document might have been made public, but it might still have names or whole paragraphs or whole pages withheld. All of that material is supposed to become public in 2017 as well. So the National Archives has a big job in pushing all of this material out the door, and we're just beginning to see that. But I think that there's going to be very interesting material that is going to come out by October 2017. So that's why we're paying close attention. I think there's significant material about the assassination and about the the cover-ups that followed that we're finally going to see.
All right, so you have this movie JFK that's put out by Oliver Stone, and at the very end of the movie, it's got this blurb. Now he posits, of course, this was a inside job, if you will, an operation of the national security state, and that they were the ones that orchestrated this assassination. And then at the very end, he's got this little sentence at the end of the movie that says there's still thousands upon thousands of documents that the government is keeping secret that related to the assassination. And I think primarily he was referring to the military and the CIA. Yeah. And so there's this huge outcry, public outcry. It was really a fascinating thing about the power of public opinion, because that outcry generated this law, didn't it?
Yes, it did. There had been a bill introduced in the 1980s about, making JFK records public. It went nowhere. After Stone put that little thing at the end of his movie, then all of a sudden people were writing to their congressman, and Lee Hamilton, the congressman from Indiana, who had been an advocate of, kind of open government, he wrote this law, the JFK Records Act, and he saw it through, and it got passed. And the power of public opinion. That law passed unanimously in the Congress. Wow. 432 to 0. Think how often that happens. That is very, very rare, especially on a controversial topic. So public opinion couldn't have been clearer, and the result was a pretty strong law. And even 25 years later, that law is having an effect. That's what we're talking about here today.
All right. So my recollection, it was also part of the presidential campaign. That somehow or another the candidates felt cornered to take the position in favor of approving the law at that time in '92. I guess it was Clinton against Bush.
Yes, it was. And there was an interesting event on the campaign trail that year. Somebody asked Clinton and Gore were on a road trip. Somebody asked Clinton, who killed Kennedy? And Clinton said, well, my running mate will answer that question first. And he kicked it to Gore. And Gore said, I think there was a conspiracy. And then they said to Clinton, what do you think? And he said, I agree with him. So, but President Bush did not like this law at all. And he attached a signing statement to the JFK Records Act, in which he said, I'm not going to release materials, if I don't think they have to be released. Now, President Bush wasn't elected, so the job fell to Clinton. And under Clinton, the White House told the JFK Review Board, we want the law to work. We're not going to intervene in behalf. So the White House really backed up the JFK Review Board, and that's why we had, a good deal of disclosure in the 1990s. That process isn't done yet, but the JFK Review Board was a good start. In terms of getting everything out of the government's possession. So, it's very difficult to do. It requires public opinion, and there's still a ways to go, in terms of getting full disclosure. So we're trying to keep the pressure on.
All right, so you've got the Assassination Records Review Board that comes into existence, in 92, 93? 93.
94 to 98 was when it was in existence.
Okay, and their job is to start securing the release of these documents from the CIA, the military, and but those agencies, the military and the CIA, still have the right at that time to say, hey, this thing involves national security, and we objected it being released, right?
Right. So they couldn't get it. They couldn't keep it secret forever, but they could request delay for up to 25 years. And then under the terms of the law, everything has to become public regardless. So that's what we're coming up against now.
Okay, now when I was listening to that videotape that you posted at JFK Facts of the woman from the National Archives, it sounded to me like she was saying that these records had to be released under the law no later than October 2017. So is that right?
Yes.
Well, doesn't that mean that she could start releasing them right now? I mean, is there any reason for her to wait till October 27 to release them?
Because the review board put a release date on them. So to respect the review board process, they have to go by whatever the review board decided. And so the review board had said this material can stay until 2017 at the request of the agency. So they could do it, but really, if the agency has requested it, the agency is going to say, no, you can't release it any earlier. So what you have here is it's not really the fault of the archives. It's the fault of the agency that requested the delay. And we don't have a review board to speed up the process. So yes, these agencies could make this stuff public earlier, and the archives could, but they feel like they have to respect the review board process all the way to the end. So that's why we're going to have to wait until October 2017. There's no real reason why this material, there's no real reason why 99% of this material couldn't be released today. There may be the name of a few living informants in there. There may be, some CIA source or method that, can't be compromised, but 99% of this stuff is not national security material.
All right, so back in the 90s, though, these agencies, including the CIA, say, look, national security requires that we delay the release of these particular records to the very end of the time period specified in the law, which is 2017.
Right.
And so that's what we're looking at now. But there's a proviso that they can still get out of this thing, isn't there?
There is. The agencies can go to the White House and request continued postponement of the release of the records. And I fully expect that some agencies are going to go and ask for continued delay after 2017. That's one reason why we're calling attention to this, is because the only thing that's going to stop them from doing it is public opinion. And people are going to say, that looks really bad. And why are you still hiding something about the JFK? But they're going to have to be shamed into not requesting that. I think their basic instinct, especially at the CIA and the other secretive agencies, is to request continued delay. They just have a culture of secrecy.
Well, yeah, that's the innocent explanation, but let's face it, secrecy is also consistent with guilt. And so,
absolutely. And the fact that I don't think, when Congress set up this law in 1992, I don't think anybody who wrote that law had any expectation that there would still be 3,500 assassination-related records that were still secret in their entirety. Nor did I think that they would think that 10%, 11% of the 300,000 JFK records in possession of the government, that more than 10% of them would contain redactions. So the secrecy that still envelops the subject 25 years later, 50 years later, 25 years after a pretty strong law, after lots of public opinion and discussion, and still we're in this position where thousands of documents are secret and tens of thousands of documents are still censored in some way. So it's very revealing of the power of these secretive agencies. And you got to ask, if you don't have anything to hide, why are you hiding so much? It's still a very fair question. If they don't have anything to hide, why are there 3,000 documents that are still secret? Now, let me just say something about these documents too. The 3,000 documents, a lot of them are probably irrelevant to the assassination, and there's no reason to keep them secret. But some of them are very important, and we know something about these documents. And I've written a little bit about what we've discovered about the documents that are still secret, and we know who they concern. And a lot of these records, I've identified 7 key files on JFK facts. These are the operational files of CIA officers who figure in the JFK assassination story in some way. They either knew about Oswald before the assassination, or they were involved in CIA assassination efforts, or they implicated themselves in the assassination. So this is very relevant material. It's got to come out. That's the thing. It's got to come out.
All right. Well, now let me let me ask you about the quantity of these records, because you've made references in the past to 1,100 CIA documents or records, and I'm not real clear whether the word documents is equal to records the way you're using them. But does that mean 1,100 pages, or does that mean something different?
So we know that there's 3,600 JFK documents withheld in full, and I'm using documents and record interchangeably. Okay. We know of those 3,600, about 1,100 are CIA documents. Okay. So the others are probably FBI, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Defense Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency, and so on. So those are documents. Now, within each document, you could have, 100 pages. So when I say 1,100 CIA documents, I figure that could be up to 50,000 pages of material.
Wow.
So, and that's just the CIA documents. If you take the 3,600 documents from all government agencies, that could be 100, 150,000 pages. You're talking about an encyclopedia. You're talking about a full shelf of books. That's how big it would be, just in terms of paper. So there's a lot of material there, and some of it is potentially very significant.
Yeah, then it just seems to me that this should be an issue on the campaign trail, that hopefully there will be people asking the candidates, are you going to grant any requests to delay this thing once more?
Yeah, I think that I'm trying to get some of the I have a social media editor, and I'm trying to get people who are interested in this subject to say, we need to ask a consistent question of all the 2016 candidates. Do you favor the release of all the JFK records by October 2017 without exception? And, that's the question that has to be put to people. And I think that if it's put to people in a public forum, the candidates are going to be pushed towards the full disclosure position, because the fact is everybody is going to be in favor of it. And one of the interesting things about the JFK story, and I've learned this in my years, is, it goes across the political spectrum. I'm kind of a liberal, left liberal, you're more a libertarian, but I have right-wing friends, and partisan politics doesn't divide people on the JFK issue. And people across the political spectrum say, we need full disclosure on this issue. And that, I think the candidates, if the candidates in 2016 can be made to feel that the breadth of public support of full disclosure in this case, from right to left, all across the middle, everybody's in favor of full disclosure, and for good reason. It's just a commonsensical position. We have a difficult historical event, and painful, controversial. People still argue about it. It just makes sense. Get everything out there. Let people decide. There's no place for secrecy in this, and that's the message that needs to be gotten across in 2016. And we have to make the candidates commit themselves, because otherwise they're going to defer to the secretive agencies. When the only thing that's going to stop the secretive agencies is public opinion.
Yeah, that's my opinion, because you posted a quote by Hillary Clinton on JFK Facts a couple of weeks ago, where she said, well, yes, I'm all in favor of full disclosure on these records. The people have a right to know, subject to national security concerns. And some of your commenters were saying, hey, this is positive. And I threw in a comment and I said, this isn't positive at all, because that's the very ground they would be using for continued secrecy.
Right. And that's why I say that the question has to be put, do you favor full disclosure without exceptions? Because they are going to take that national security exception, and you can drive a truck through that loophole.
Of course. I've argued in the past that, for one thing, the term national security has no objective meaning at all. It's a nebulous, subjective type term. It depends on whatever meaning people want to put to it. And so, yeah, and the notion, whenever you see these documents that are released that they claim are going to affect national security, like the Edward Snowden documents or whatever, nothing ever happens. I don't know of any case where the United States has fallen into the ocean, or the government has collapsed, or the communists have taken over over the release of government documents that they say are going to threaten national security.
Yeah, and the national security justification, if you think about it, really, it's the ultimate paranoid position. right? It's the idea that if we release a document, and some of these documents, a lot of these documents are 50 years old. And so the national security position is, if we release this fact, something terrible will happen. It's very paranoid. It's very crazy, you know? And the fact is, no, nothing's going to happen. There is no national security material in these withheld documents, or an infinitesimal amount. You know, an infinitesimal amount. 99.9% of this stuff could be released tomorrow. It's not national security. It's political embarrassment. That's the problem.
Well, my hunch would be that most of the documents that were released during the term of the ARRB, they were saying should not be released because of national security.
Absolutely. And the agencies at that time argued with the ARB and said, no, you couldn't possibly do this. And the review board staff said, you know, in most cases, forget it, we're going to release it. And nothing ever happened. No one was ever harmed.
No, except the agencies themselves, that they disclosed wrongdoing, like Operation Northwoods, that they had succeeded in keeping secret that infamous plan that the Joint Chiefs of Staff presented to Kennedy to have bogus terrorist attacks and blame them on Castro and stuff. But Jeff, if we go back to the very beginning of this thing, we got the Warren Commission report, and they come out with a report that this was a lone nut assassination. I've never been able to understand how it was that they kept anything secret. If it's just a lone nut, then why do you need to keep anything relating to an assassination committed by a lone nut secret? Why would there be anything involving national security? The guy just happens to be there. He shoots the president. I mean, I found the whole thing bizarre, where they had to keep things secret for 75 years. And then Warren comes out with this strange cryptic statement that says, well, something to the effect that not in your lifetime will you able to really know what happened here, and so forth. And then you jump forward to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and again, they release some stuff, but then there's a 50-year limit placed on a lot of their documents. I mean, like, what's that all about?
I mean, what it's about is that, you know, the story that was concocted of what had happened, that some guy came out of the blue and up and shot the president for no reason, you know, that story was a lie. I mean, the accused assassin was in fact very well known at the highest levels of the CIA shortly before the president was killed. So you had this enormous intelligence failure, and at a minimum, even if it was true that Oswald did shoot the president, and I'm not sure that it is, but even if that were true, you know, the director of the CIA, people should have lost their jobs because they failed to detect the threat to the president. Well, those people didn't want to lose their jobs. They wanted to keep their jobs, and with the power of secrecy, they were enabled to hide the CIA's surveillance of Oswald for the 4 years preceding the assassination, and foist this much more convenient, less politically difficult story on the public that some guy up and shot the president for some guy that we never heard of came out of nowhere and shot the president for no reason. And so, you know, in order to save their jobs, the national security agencies had to construct that story, which wasn't true. They had actually had Oswald under surveillance, and there's a lot of evidence that somebody in the national security agencies was manipulating Oswald as he made his way to Dallas. So that's the story that couldn't come out, and that's the story that has persisted. You know, Oliver Stone interpreted those facts and, you know, developed a kind of powerful, what he called a counter myth of the assassination. And, you know, that's a fairly plausible view that Kennedy's enemies within his own government somehow, you know, arranged his assassination and avoided taking the blame for it. A lot of people think that, you know, and so we need to see all the records in order to decide whether that's true or not. So it's really about, you know, the country's history and the people's history, and, you know, will we be able to learn it? And, you know, we made a lot of progress. We understand the assassination and the events leading up to the assassination much better now than we did even at the time of Stone's movie. We've learned a lot and we have a clearer picture, but we're still not there yet in terms of really getting the record finalized and clear.
Yeah, the work that you've done disclosing that the surveillance they had of Oswald prior to the assassination is really fascinating. In my new book, Regime Change, I point out how strange it was that they didn't touch this guy. Here's a guy who supposedly defected to the Soviet Union or did defect, and he supposedly was going to release all these secret records or information that he had acquired while he was stationed at the Air Force base in Japan at Sugi, where the U-2 was based. This guy comes back and does all these pro-communist activities supposedly. They don't lay a hand on him. There's no criminal indictment. There's no harassment. There's no abuse. I mean, look how they're treating Edward Snowden. Look how they treated John Walker Lind. That's how they treat people that do these kind of things. They never lay a finger on Oswald.
Yeah, you know, he's the. There are two curious things about Oswald that we now understand as a result of what the review board released in the 1990s. One is just how closely he was watched. And then two, your point, that the way the response to him was very curious. A guy who was repeatedly, raising his security profile. The question of whether he was a security risk. He defected. He offered to share military secrets. He returned to the United States. He returned with a Russian wife. He's active with a Fair Play for Cuba, which is on the government's subversive list. And yet somehow the government never responds, the secretive agencies never respond in the way you would expect to that type of person. And so this is still what's unexplained about Oswald, was both that he was very closely watched by people at the top of the CIA, and that they didn't respond in what you would think the normal way that they would respond to somebody who was clearly some kind of security risk. So that's why the assassination remains unexplained, because the accused assassin is a much more interesting figure than the story that was put out by the Dallas police and the FBI, that some guy who we never heard of just up and shot the president. And God, we're sorry. It's just really, really too bad, but it just didn't happen for any reason, and it's like, you could believe that for a little while, but people right away just started saying, huh? And then that guy's killed in police custody by another guy, and he wasn't killed for any reason to, don't pay no attention to any of this. It's like the Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. After a while, the public was like, huh? And when people started to dig into it, and they were told, oh, no, you can't find any the records of the Warren Commission because they're going to be hidden for 75 years. Like you said, if it was just a lone nut, why do you have to hide this for 75 years?
Right. And they were going after people in the Fair Play for Cuba committee, and that was the big anti-communist crusade. But in the limited time we have left, can you just tell, one of the most fascinating pieces of work that you've done is on this CIA agent named Joannides. Would you talk a little bit about Joannides, how he figures into this whole story, and why they want to keep his record secret?
Well, so when I got into this thing, one thing I wanted to try and figure out was who were CIA officers who knew about Oswald before the assassination, because clearly that was something the government wanted to hide all along. And in the course of doing research in Miami and trying to figure out, who might have been, I came across the story of this officer, George Joannides, who was a mid-level psychological warfare operations officer based in Miami. And one of his job was he was the case officer for a group of Cuban exiles who were opposed to Castro, the Cuban Student Directorate. And it was members of the Cuban Student Directorate who had a confrontation with Oswald in August of 1963, which resulted in Oswald's arrest. It was the most public display of Oswald's pro-Castro politics, because he was kind of a leftist sympathizer. And it turned out that group that had these confrontations with Oswald in New Orleans was funded by the CIA and run by this officer, Joannides. So meaning he, kept track of their budget, he kept track of their activities, he maintained the contact, he passed the money to them. So when I heard his story, and I found some guys in Miami who knew him and described him to me, and talked about their relationship with him, which was close but combative. So it's a real guy. He was very deeply engaged with this group. And so I did a FOIA with the CIA saying, who is this guy? And the review board, first I told the review board back in the 90s, why don't you ask the CIA for records of this guy? And CIA said, we have no records of this guy. That wasn't true. Then the review board went out of existence. So I did a FOIA for the CIA's records. And they came back and they said, we're not going to give you any records about what he was doing. And we're not going to say what he was doing in Miami in 1962 to 64. And I thought, this is really suspicious. This guy's in charge of Cubans who have contact with Oswald before the assassination. Very provocative behavior on behalf of a leftist pro-Castro group. Why wouldn't a CIA officer be interested in that? Of course he would be interested in that. So what did he say? What did he think of Oswald? And my point was, fine, Oswald's guilty. What did Joannides know about him? What did he report about him in, when he was, fighting with these Cubans? The CIA has stonewalled me for 10 years on this question.
Wow.
They don't want to talk about it. Now, I don't have a conspiracy theory about George Joannides. I don't know what he was doing. In fact, I am pretty sure he was not an intellectual author of Kennedy's death, and I doubt he was a witting participant in an assassination conspiracy. But he was on the scene in 1963, and the doubly suspicious thing about him is 15 years later, when Congress investigates, the CIA calls him out of retirement, and he stonewalls the congressional investigators about his own role in the events of 1963. So the CIA is stonewalling me today. Joannides himself misled congressional investigators in 1978, and he was doing something with the Cubans who knew Oswald in 1963. And we know nothing about this story 50 years later. And the CIA is spending our money in court to prevent the release of these records that might clarify this question. So that's pretty suspicious.
Well, yeah, and I remember reading a quote by Judge Tunham, who was the chairman of the Assassination Records Review Board. He's a federal judge. He said something about Joannides had obstructed justice as far as he was concerned. And then Robert Blakey, who was the counsel for the House Select Committee in the 70s, he came out against this what they had done with Joannides too, right? Because he was stonewalling that committee.
Yeah, Blakey met personally with Joannides, and Joannides never said, oh, I know something about the events of 1963. He pretended that he didn't know anything. And Blakey said, this guy was he was a material witness to the assassination. He's somebody they would have wanted to interview. And instead he deceived them. So, and the CIA says, we have no right to know this whole story because of national security. I mean, it's a crazy argument. It's either absurd or it's sinister. Those are the only two choices.
Well, and I remember reading a book recently that said something to the effect of what the policy of the CIA is on covert assassinations. That this is what they were teaching the people in Latin America, Latin American dictatorial regimes, is that when you have a state-sponsored assassination, the best policy is to blame it on a communist. And I think that's where the DRE really, it does look sinister, because immediately after the assassination, the DRE comes out with this publicity campaign advertising Oswald's communist bona fides. And what they were keeping secret, as you've pointed out, is that the CIA was funding them and that Joannides was apparently their supervising officer. Is that right?
Right. Yes, he was. And his assignment, his specialty within the espionage world, the covert action world, was psychological warfare, which is exactly this kind of thing where you take an action and you blame it on the enemy, because that's how you change the psychology of the situation. So, yes, it's very suspicious. It's very curious, and it's incidentally the CIA. I've been talking with them for 10 years. They've never come to me and said, Jeff, you got it wrong. This is actually what was happening, right? Which is what the CIA does, with reporters to explain things when, they want to get the story straight. They take you aside and they say, look, off the record, here's the explanation of what's going on. You thought this, but it's actually this way. And sometimes they're right. They've never done that in the case of Joannides. They never come and said, Jeff, you're totally wrong. He wasn't doing that in Miami. He was doing something else. That's possible. I don't rule it out because I don't have a theory about this. Whatever they tell me, I'll take it. But what's interesting is they're stonewalling, and they don't really have a story. They've never offered a counter explanation to somebody like me who says, gee, this looks awfully suspicious.
Okay, on that note, we got to wrap it up. I ought to point out to our viewers that Jeff is a former reporter for the Washington Post, and so that's why he talks like a reporter. Jeff, it's great to have you on, man. Really enjoyed the conversation. And
Fantastic. So yeah, I hope your libertarian friends will check out JFK Facts, and we'll have more and more on this story, in the coming years. We're not going away.
Yeah, go to jfkfacts.org, and then there's constantly new postings taking place. The comments are absolutely fantastic. They have some of those brilliant people doing comments there, and I love the site. I go there every day, sometimes twice a day. So thanks again, Jeff. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, and we'll see you next week.